Thank you, Mike Sigler, for sitting down with us ahead of the upcoming election. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel.
So, starting with question number 1, voters will be voting on Proposition 1, the proposal to protect against unequal treatment based on ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, and sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and pregnancy. It also protects against unequal treatment based on reproductive health care and autonomy. Mike, where is your stance on New York State Prop 1, and what would you tell people who are on the fence about this proposition?
Right, I think I think Prop 1 is a Trojan horse. I mean, it was ostensibly about abortion, but it isn't about abortion. It's about all those other things that you just talked about and making them into special classes. And the problem with making anything a special class is it confers rights onto those special classes. And you just heard, like national origin. So does that give illegal people that are in the country illegally rights that they haven't earned? That they're not? Do they give the rights of U.S. citizens to people that are in the country illegally? Also, we talk about gender identity. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean a 14-year-old who perhaps identifies as another gender then can make decisions about, I would like to take hormonal therapy? Would the doctor be allowed to say no to that? Because what you just said is you put this person into a special class and you're inviting lawsuits about that. And I don't believe that 14-year-olds should be having hormonal therapy to change their sex. I think that's dangerous. I think that over in Europe, for example, they've already moved away from that, and I think America should take a lesson from that. So I'm hoping that people will go out and vote against Prop 1.
What would you say is the top issue affecting the 52nd State Senate District? Well,
there's two. I mean, cost. Everybody I talk to is cost. And it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, or anything like that. For young people, they talk a lot more about car insurance and things like that. For older people, they talk more about food and just the price of taxes, for example, the cost of how much their taxes have gone up. It's one thing with property tax. With your income tax, at least you have an income that goes up, and hopefully you can pay that income tax. But with property tax, you can't sell your garage to pay your property tax. So you see things like this in energy. Energy is probably the best example we have. When you look at my opponent, every policy that she puts forward raises the cost of electricity and raises the cost of heating your home. Right? The policy there is we're not going to have any more natural gas in the state. Not just for generation, I'm talking for heating, pipelines. They don't want any of that. They would like us to move off fossil fuels completely. That would be something you could do if you move to something like nuclear power where you're lowering the cost of electricity. But that's not what they're talking about either. We've basically outstated to Pennsylvania our electricity production. It hasn't meant that we've used any less natural gas. We're using more natural gas today than we did just 5 years ago. So these are raising the costs. A perfect example of this is the school bus mandates. Everybody's been talking about these. The school buses cost 3 times more than a diesel school bus. You need a whole new charging system. You need all new wiring to get more power to that point. And then you need a new bus garage to house them all. The costs are enormous. We're talking billions of dollars that frankly will have to come out of your property tax, your school property tax, which is your #1 tax. So people should be very concerned about that.
Housing is an issue both state and local politicians address. How will you ensure that the state provides the resources needed for local municipalities to support housing concerns?
Well, when it comes to housing, we're very good at making sites ready for industry, for example. We'll go into an area like Clay, New York. We'll make the site ready so you can build Micron, you'll have the water, you have the electricity. But for some reason, we are not able to do that with housing. And we did this before. This is not something new. This is not an original idea. After World War II, Long Island, we put in the roads, we put in the water, we put in the sewer, put in the electric. And that way, when a builder comes in, the risks they're not there anymore, right? All they have to do is come in and build the house. So the costs have come down quite a bit. If we were to do that as a state and go after that kind of building construct, we would make housing more affordable, because that's the goal. Right now, the state is very into affordable housing, but they're not very into making housing affordable. We're very good at building apartment buildings, it seems, but we're not good at building single-family homes and things like that, which is what people really are desirous of.
What steps need to be taken to ensure people have access to mental health resources?
Well, I personally think what we're doing in Tompkins County is we're trying to build a mental health stabilization unit. You just got one here in Broome County. We're envious. We struggled to do this. We put aside $1.5 million to put this into place. We're bringing it online, thankfully, because of Cayuga Medical Center. What we want to do is when we pick somebody up off the street and they're having a mental health crisis, jail is probably not the best place to take them immediately. If they've committed a crime, we'll handle that separately. But we want to get them stable. We want to get them into a condition so that we can make some decisions about where their life is going to take them. So mental health stabilization unit in every county, but also a detox facility. A lot of times mental illness, a lot of people self-medicate and they use alcohol, or they use drugs and opioids. This is the kind of problems we're dealing with right now. We need detox centers. My opponent, for example, she's supportive of supervised injection sites. That to me is just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. I mean, we need to get people off the drugs because eventually it will catch up to them. Eventually, opioids will kill that person.
The recreational cannabis industry in New York State continues to grow. What do you think needs to be done to ensure this recreational cannabis industry can grow responsibly?
Well, I think the rollout was terrible. The state did not treat it like alcohol, for example. I personally voted for cannabis legalization when I was in the county legislature. Still am in the county legislature, but I voted for that. Why? I think that adults can make that choice. But I did warn about some of the problems you were going to have with cannabis rollout. You were going to have younger people smoking. I mean, frankly, anybody under the age of 25 has to be very cautious because your brain is continuing to grow until you're 25 years old. This can cause long-term damage. The other thing I've seen, you know, I do a lot of door-to-door. I go doors and I go knock on people's doors and I talk to them about the election and why they should vote for me. I walked up to one house and the air's blowing out and I could smell the weed blowing out. I knock on the door and a 10-year-old opens the door. Obviously the 10-year-old's not smoking weed, but someone in the house is, and right in front of this child. So while we have cannabis and while it's legal, we do have to put these curbs in. Right now, we have illegal marijuana shops operating, and we need to go after those and close those so that the legal, who have paid a license to be legal, and when you go in, now you know how much THC is in the weed, you know what you're getting when you go and buy it, but then we also have to invest money in if somebody wants to get off drugs completely. We need to invest in that. And we do have to keep our kids safe. So anytime you see anything that's not above board when it comes to underage people buying, we have to go after just like we did with alcohol.
New York State's bail reform laws remain controversial nearly 5 years after its passing. Do you think Albany needs to revisit bail reform laws, and if so, why?
They just haven't been effective. I mean, if you talk to any Leo on the street, they'll tell you what's happened. I mean, they, in some cases, have stopped arresting people for smaller crimes because they know they just pick them up and the judge releases them immediately because the judge says their hands are tied. We need to untie the judge's hands. The number one problem with bail reform, as I see it, was they put constraints on what the judge could do. The judge is a frontline worker, just like the police officer is, just like an emergency medical technician is. They're the first ones seeing this case. So when you bring somebody in, you want the judge to have a lot of latitude. Are they going to make mistakes? Sure they are, of course. I mean, judges are people, they're going to make mistakes just like anybody else. But what you hope is the mistake will be small, and you also are getting what's best for that person at that very moment. So even the governor has called for some reforms, and the legislature has said no, they don't want any reforms to bail reform so far.
Small businesses and residents are struggling under the strains of inflation. And what is your plan to combat inflation?
Well, inflation is, I mean, it's a big topic. I mean, it's certainly something at the national level. We printed an awful lot of money, and that has driven up inflation. And again, that's something that we can take up with our Congress people and you can take up with the president. When it comes to inflation, though, in costs, that's something we can really talk about when we talk about the cost of food. Right now, this state, for example, with green energy, it wants to build out solar panels across upstate New York, and it's going to cover up a lot of farmland to do that. Well, what happens if you cover up the farmland in favor of solar panels? Well, that farmer then has to go further to get the same land and to grow the same food. Around my house, all of that is active farmland that's going to get covered up. Then the farmer will have to go 30 miles away instead of just a mile away from where the dairy cows are. And that milk doesn't just go into the milk supply. It gets taken up to Auburn, it gets processed into milk isolate, and gets put into baby formula. But if we're raising the cost of production, then that baby formula is necessarily going to have to go up in cost. So we need to look at that. And the other thing is taxes. I mean, the property taxes in this state have gone up so much that people really are wondering if they can afford the bill. And that's eating into their whole budget line. So those are two big areas that we need to tackle when it comes to inflation.
Flooding has always remained a concern for the greater Binghamton area. What steps would you take to keep the community safe from flooding?
Well, a lot of the work has been done here in Broome County. I mean, we've built the flood walls. So what we need to do is work with the federal government and you know, the Army Corps of Engineers and say what will happen next. It's clear that we're getting more rain. I've talked to the people at Cornell. We've gotten more rain each and every year. If you look at the gutters on your own house, right, you're looking and saying, maybe I need larger gutters. You might, because we're just, the storm events, it's not that they're even getting more severe. We are getting a lot more rain, though. And so those rivers are going to swell. So maybe we have to look at how high are the flood walls, what direction, when the flood waters get high, can we divert the flood waters to a different direction so that we don't have flooding in the city? I mean, we want to keep our core, our most vulnerable areas contained. In Ithaca, we're all looking right now, 850 homes we are looking at that may have to buy flood insurance because they've now put the entire downtown area of Ithaca into a flood zone. What's one solution there? We need to build wetlands higher up so that the water won't just run off the hills and the mountains into the downtown Ithaca. They'll run into these basically a floodplain or a wetland and holding areas so that the water can then go into the ground. So those are the kind of efforts that I think should be made.
What is the key to remaining bipartisan during a time of intense political polarization at the federal level?
I think you got to do things with a smile. No, listen, I come from an area, Lansing, New York, that it's a blue area. I mean, my district is blue. It's not very blue. It's more purplish. But, and Tompkins County is a blue county. In fact, it's the bluest county in New York State. But what you do is you find common ground. I think most people, you know, some people say, oh, all politicians are crooked, or they're not. Most politicians are good people. They're in it for the right reasons. So you find the areas of consensus. Mental health, I think, is an area of consensus. Drug addiction, I think, is somewhat an area of consensus. I mean, obviously, we have different approaches to it. But how do we find common ground? I mean, I think we're all in it to make people's lives better. And how do we do that? We'll have different paths, maybe, but maybe that other path is the right path. Maybe we should take a look at that and draw different parts from it. The greatest thing about running for office is I get to come to areas of the district that maybe I haven't been before, and you know, go out and take their ideas. You know, Binghamton, there are things going on in downtown Binghamton that Ithaca will be jealous of, and there are things going on in Ithaca that Cortland will be jealous of, but they don't have to be. We can bring all of that together, and we can use what's going on in these different areas and apply them to the other city.
Under your 14 years as the Tompkins County legislator, what are your accomplishments?
One of my favorite ones is the parks. I started this parks program, and it was not a big program. I mean, it's $50,000, which is it's a sizable amount. But the nice thing about it was an open check to the towns, so the towns could come and they could apply for the grant money. And what it did was it allowed the towns to kind of communicate better with the county, and that's something you always want. You want the different levels of government communicating. And now I drive around to all these parks and I see what they've used the money for. And it's a nice experience. It's nice to go to these towns and say, oh, you know, I had a small hand in that. And what it also does is, and this is something Albany hasn't learned yet, you want to send this money out to the different communities because you have all this brain power out there working in all these different communities. And it's the same thing with the cities, right? You want to take the ideas from Binghamton and from Ithaca and utilize them in the different cities. Albany needs to do that. It needs to go to Binghamton, New York and say, what's your idea in driving this state forward into the future? And yet, I don't find that happening that often. I don't find Albany, they'll pass a law, it'll roll down to the counties or the towns, and they'll just say, kind of do this. And they won't provide the funding, they won't provide the expertise, and that's where they go awry. They should be doing it from the ground up instead of from the top down.
That is all the questions we have tonight. Mike Sigler, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us ahead of this election.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for having me on.